So we're just a little over a week into Diablo 4 Season 4, with tons of players playing and trying out the Minions Necromancer. The consensus has sort of settled around the Shadow Minion variant of the build being the best for endgame and pit pushing. But I say, where's the fun in following a cookie cutter build on max roll? So I thought I would not only try out, but actually go balls deep into developing the Thorns variant of the Necromancer, and actually a Thorns Shadow Minion Necromancer, which actually benefits from most of the scaling of the standard endgame S tier supposedly Shadow Minion Necromancer, but also has a ton more damage added onto it while sacrificing a little bit of the Shadow side to gain Thorns on my build. And even if I don't end up being able to compete absolutely neck and neck with the pure Shadow Summoner Necromancer, at least I'll be able to say that I tried my best and also had a ton of fun in doing so. And with that, I welcome you to buckle up and join me while I dive into the Shadow Thorns Minions Necromancer. Now in general, compared to the supposed S tier Shadow Minions build, this build can actually offer some advantages, although probably some disadvantages as well, although I'm not quite sure which would actually win out in the end game, right? And there's sort of a difference in playstyle as well, with Thorns being sort of the more passive approach, or one that sort of allows you to cruise to easier parts of the game without really paying much attention to it, right? That's sort of the whole idea and fantasy of running Thorns as sort of a personal preference. So in that way, I suppose it wins out over the Shadow Minions, in my opinion. But for some other notable differences, first of all, even though I am sacrificing some aspects, namely in the chest plate, where I have to run Razor Plate for my main source of Thorns, and also in another aspect where I'm running Needle Flare, where normally for Shadow Necromancers or Shadow Minion Necromancers, one of their rings would be Sacrilegious Soul, where that would be passively proccing your corpse skills, right? Another alternative is they would run the aspect where you can like spawn a Blight pool whenever you use your, or whenever you cast your Bone Prison, right? And you wouldn't have to even put Blight on your bar and would have Bone Prison instead. And perhaps also run the other aspect where you're pulling in enemies with your Blight. So I'm not running those because again, I want to maximize my Thorns damage, but the trade-off for that is I am gaining a massive, huge, massive, insane source of damage from my Thorns, right? So I still gain a lot of the benefits and a lot of the power from the normal Shadow Minion setup, although it's not like super min-max to the same degree where I have as many stacking sources of, say, Shadow Blight, but my Golem is still kicking butt, and I still have this additional source of damage, which in my opinion would provide just as much, if not more damage. But again, I would still need to test this out much more compared to the traditional Shadow Minions build. And real quick, I'll just mention that for my chest plate here, I am potentially sacrificing a, say, defensive aspect or mostly utility aspect, because really the only defensive aspect you'll need to run as a Necromancer, assuming your armor capped, is Hardened Bones, right? Which most Necros will have on their amulet anyway. But anyhow, for the chest plate, I might be missing out on some things like primary stat, and actually a big thing that I am admittedly missing out on by using Razor Plate is plus to Golem Mastery, which does notably spawn on the chest plate. So I'm sort of missing out on, I believe, +4 or +5 Golem Mastery, which I'm not sure if in the super deep depths of the pit, whether my power will be enough to kill some of the bosses in there, but I guess we'll see. But still, if we just switch over to Razor Plate, if I get, say, greater affixes and also masterwork this to the max, this will be maybe more than double the amount of Thorns that I have here, which we'll see whether that offsets the lack of Golem Mastery in my build. Another major difference between my build and some traditional Necromancer builds is I'm not running Corpse Tendrils or other forms of crowd control, except for Taunt from the Golem, right? Or perhaps sometimes Taunt from the Skeletal Defenders as well. However, I'm not running Corpse Tendrils, which is a major source of crowd control for a lot of builds, although I'm sort of substituting Blood Mist for that, right? And I also am still running Bone Storm, which will make things really safe since I have the Shielding Storm aspect as well. So what I can do is, whenever my Bone Storm is not up, I still have the taunt from my Golem to soak up damage, and I can use Blood Mist sort of as a panic button while I wait for some of the other cooldowns, right? If you really wanted to, and I've thought about this, you can even turn this into an Infinimist variant where you're using the aspect for Blood Mist where it'll actually detonate corpses and lower its cooldown, as in detonate and cause corpse explosions and lower its cooldown further. Decrepify though, if you have enough lucky hit, will also allow you to lower your cooldowns on your Blood Mist anyway, on top of your Skeletal Reapers. So if you have enough lucky hit, and if you temper things like Blood Mist cooldown, or I think Blood Mist duration is actually better in this case if you want to run an Infinimist variant, you might even be able to get away with having really high uptime on Blood Mist and not necessarily have to run Shielding Storm even. Although currently I kind of like the Shielding Storm option because this gives me sort of both options to stay alive. Although my Blood Mist hasn't quite reached that high of an uptime just yet. Nor am I sure if I want to really commit into tempering a lot of the Blood Mist cooldown affixes. In terms of how Thorns actually works and what it scales off of, it's pretty straightforward. Essentially, it's mainly just your Thorn stat, which again comes mostly from your Razor Plate, and then that will be multiplied by your Intelligence, or your primary stat, right? Which in this case for the Necro, it would be Intelligence. So these are the primary ways that Thorns scales, but you also have some other tempered affixes like Thorns while fortified, which will further buff your Thorns, again of course while you're fortified, and this can actually scale to pretty high numbers if you masterwork. And there's also another type of affix which allows your minions to inherit additional amounts of Thorns past the 100% that they would inherit normally, right? Because again, in this patch or in Season 4, minions actually inherit 100% of your stats, and this actually allows them to go beyond that in terms of their Thorns. And another sort of lesser known way that Thorns can get buffed is with the Bone Golem specifically, where if you activate it, it also gains additional Thorns based on how much armor it has. And again, this will just be your own base armor, right? Which will be around cap at around 9,200-ish. Now, Thorns also scales off damage increases, so like additive bonuses and things like that, such as if you have any like percent damage on your character sheet or things like damage to close, your Paragon Board can be a pretty big contributor to that as well. All these sort of multiplicative damage increases or general damage increases will affect Thorns as well, such as the Amplify glyph here, which increases your damage against cursed enemies and so forth. And also, Vulnerable is a great way to scale Thorns, or rather deliver a multiplier to it, a 1.2 times at least multiplier. So you do want to try to apply Vulnerable or incorporate Vulnerable in your build somehow. One of the ways that I've been able to do so is with the, again, Bone Golem, the second version here. It applies Vulnerable. Again, I'm currently not running Corpse Tendrils, so that source of Vulnerable is not available to me because again, I try not to CC enemies too much to allow them to be constantly hitting my minions, right, to be able to proc Thorns. Alternatively, on your rings now in Season 4, there's also a way to, or there's also a new affix, a base affix, that allows your character to gain a lucky hit chance to proc Vulnerable as well. So that is yet another way to get Vulnerable in addition to, say, Bone Golem, and something that I'm heavily considering as well. Aside from that, there are mainly just two legendary effects or unique item effects that affect your Thorns, namely, first of all, your Needle Flare aspect, which allows your Thorns to cleave, and this can pretty much stack up. If, say, your enemies hit multiple of your skeletons at once, it'll just cause a bunch of them to splash all at the same time, dealing massive damage. And of course, the other way is with Razor Plate, where with this new effect, there's a 10% for your Thorns to essentially crit for a really high multiplier as well. Now, going over my skill tree really quick, this is actually quite straightforward as most of it is actually taken from a more cookie cutter, say, max roll Shadow Minions build, which again seems to be an extremely powerful version of the Minion Necromancer at the end game. So I will have most of my skill tree being based on that, but the notable differences are I'm not speccing into any of these darkness passes over here currently. My current preferences are again maxing Blood Mist for the lower cooldown, just for like a second panic button in addition to my Bone Storm, which I am running the barrier aspect for, but just having a second panic button for pits I think can be, in theory at least, a lot more safe, especially seeing as there's a huge penalty for dying in the pits, right? As long as I'm still doing enough damage, of course. But another notable difference is I'm running spiked armor for some bonus thorns. Although the thorns amount is not that high, but the bonus armor can be pretty helpful. But it would kind of depend on how much armor you have on your gear as well, right? I am kind of overshooting my armor a little bit. I have over 10k, which is definitely overkill. So I might consider taking a couple of points out of this as well, but we'll see. But the rest is pretty standard cookie cutter Shadow Minions build. So I have Blight here with the Supernatural Blight, which will just give me an additional multiplier, especially against bosses and elites. I am maxing Grim Harvest here, where I can just spam my raised skeleton to gain essence whenever my other skills are on cooldown, right? Not counting Blood Mist again, which of course is a panic bot. And then for the rest of my skills here, it's Decrepify for the lowered cooldown. Of course, maxing out all the masteries for my minions, getting some of these good damage and movement speed passives, getting Fortify from Necrotic Carapace, getting Bone Storm for the shadow damage that it's proccing and additional survivability, and last but not least, Shadow Blight as a key passive, of course. So I'm not running Corpse Tendrils, and I'm also not running Corpse Explosion because with how tight my aspects are on my gear, I can't really spare a ring to run Sacrilegious Soul, although I could technically run Corpse Explosion, maybe spare some points from somewhere, run Corpse Explosion and perhaps say not Blood Mist to proc my Shadow Blight even more and just spam it manually. That could be a way, and I might actually test that out. But currently I think the survivability from Blood Mist and also the Unstoppable is just a bit safer, although I'm not quite sure whether that's overkill and how that balances out with the damage. That would require further testing as I push further into the depths of the pit. As for the Book of the Dead, I'm running Skeletal Warriors with Reaper actually. I tried out Defenders for the taunt, which again will allow your Thorns to proc a bit more. But I actually found the cooldown reduction from Reapers to be a lot more useful, especially for your survivability, where you'll have a lot more uptime on Bone Storm, and secondarily also Golem and Blood Mist to some extent. And I think there's currently a bug where if you pick the second upgrade where it says you'll get additional corpses from the Reapers, but this will also lower your cooldowns as well, with the first upgrade supposedly being the one that lowers cooldown. So this could get patched, so just beware of that. But even when it gets patched, I might just switch over to the cooldown reduction here. And now I'm not running Taunt on my Defenders right now, but it can still be quite strong, especially for staggering bosses and things like that, right? And just allowing your Skeletal Warriors to proc Thorns. If you don't say need as much cooldown reduction, or if your gear is like super duper masterworked and you have tons of cooldown reduction and like lucky hit to lower cooldowns with Decrepify, right? So Defenders can still be a potential option here, but I might still have to test this out further. Next, for Skeletal Mages, I'm running the Shadow Mage and with the damage multiplier here, and I'm also running the additional mages and skeletons, so this will further increase my damage from that. And then last but not least, for the Golem, although the Blood Golem is an extremely powerful contender here for its massive damage and also like activatable and single target damage against bosses, which I might test out as well and compare that against the Bone Golem. One of the main reasons I'm running the Bone Golem right now is not only for the taunt, and again that helps with survivability, right, to get enemies off you, but also for the vulnerable that it's able to apply when enemies are hitting it. Because I currently don't have the lucky hit proccing vulnerable affix on my ring just yet, so I'm currently relying sort of on my Bone Golem for vulnerable. And again, because also I'm not running Corpse Tendrils, right? Because with this build, I don't want to CC enemies too much to allow my Thorns to do its work. Now going over my current gear really quick, and of course this is very far from optimized, but first of all, I of course have Razor Plate as your main source of Thorns. And this actually drops from Lord's here. It's the only boss that drops the Razor Plate. I farmed in for quite a bit, but I didn't get a single drop of Razor Plate, so I ended up going to DiabloTrade.com, which is actually an official Blizzard website. And speaking of which, I actually made another video detailing a lot of the third-party websites and also useful websites in general that I use to help me with Diablo 4 that you can check out in the description below, but I digress. So I actually used DiabloTrade.com to buy this for 4 million gold. This is far from the best Razor Plate that I could have gotten, but it does the job for now, right? Later on I'll try to get a better piece, of course, and I've sort of masterworked this a little bit as well. But anyhow, going back to my helm, I have 2 greater affixes, albeit not the best procs because my armor is overcapped and the Thorns is comparatively low compared to Razor Plate, but some other affixes that are good are cooldown reduction, lucky hit chance is good here, any Thorns that you need, any resistance that you need to get capped, and also max health. For the tempering affixes, I think Blood Mist duration would be good here if you want to go sort of the defensive or Infinimist option. You might even want more Blood Mist duration rolls if you really wanted to go for that. But the other one is, so that would be the defensive affix, and for the utility one, I would recommend Thorns Army. So you basically have 3 pieces or 4 pieces that you can work with for utility aspects, namely your helm, your gloves, pants, and boots. And for one of them, I would actually recommend going for Decrepify Size. So for the rest, I would go for Thorns Army for the utility aspect. Again, on these 4 pieces, I would have one Decrepify Size, and then the others being some kind of Thorns Army. And these are competing affixes, right? Because they're all part of the utility category. But anyhow, aside from just getting one Decrepify Size, which I think is really good quality of life, having Thorns Army on your other 3 pieces here, I think, in theory at least, I would try to get 1 or 2 thorns while fortified, because this will greatly boost the amount of thorns that you have, and it scales off Razor Plate too. And actually the other one does as well, which is Skeletal Warriors Inherit Your Thorns. I would prioritize that over Skeletal Mages or Golems, because in theory at least, whenever your Skeletal Warriors get hit, there's a big chance that multiple of them would get hit, right? So this would actually scale with multiple of your minions if they all get hit at once, say by the same enemy, right? So I think the Skeletal Warriors version, or just the general minions one, would be good and better than the Golems variant in my opinion, because the Golem is just a single target and thus it cannot get sort of cleaved and benefit from this multiple times, unlike the Warriors. And for defensive tempering, again, you can go for Blood Mist, Duration, or Cooldown. I think Duration is slightly better. You can also hit Resist if you have any lacking Resist. But really, all you can work with is with your helm and your pants for defensive affixes. You can kind of just go with whatever you prefer for that. I would probably just go for Blood Mist Duration on both my helm and my pants. So on my pants, I actually have poison res here. It's only because I bricked it. Now, moving on to my aspects really quick. I haven't really gotten into that just yet. For my aspects on my helm, I have hulking. Again, this is very, very standard. So it's hulking, which is for the golem, because again, the golem is still a huge source of damage. Moving on to my gloves, I have attack speed, crit chance, lucky hit chance. The plus skills, you have like +2 skeletal mage that you can roll, is not that useful because your source of damage, a big source of your damage will be from Shadow Blight itself and not from the skeletal mages. For the affix here, I have Frenzied Death to increase attack speed to cause more Shadow Blight procs, and also to allow my golem to do a lot more work. Moving on to my pants, I have Shielding Storm here, and then the affixes are pretty standard. It's just Intelligence, Max Life, Armor if you need it, and then for the Tempering, I just talked about it. It's again Thorns Army, and of course of all the utility aspects from here on this row, you'll want one Decrepify Size, or that's my recommendation at least. And the rest you want Thorns Army, namely optimally Skeletal Warriors. Moving on to pants. Oh, and for the aspect here, I have Shielding Storm, which is self-explanatory. For my boots here, again, very standard affixes, int, max life, move speed, a second move speed roll with tempering, and then another Thorns Army that I have here. And then the imprint, I have a Cult Dominion, which is very helpful for various reasons, right? For lowering my cooldown with Skeletal Reapers, and for proccing additional Shadow Blights with my Skeletal Mages, and so forth. For my weapon here, I have a random vulnerable damage here, but I would probably rather have something else. It's not the worst affix to have in the world, but something like plus damage could also be good and help out my thorns as well. But there's not too huge of a difference with these. For the tempering, I have minion attack speed. You generally want this on your weapons, including your offhand. It mainly benefits your Shadow Blight procs and also your golem, of course. And then for the offensive affixes, I didn't really mention this for my gloves or any of my offensive pieces, but you generally want damage to cursed enemies. Here on my gloves, I do have Golem's damage. This would be good if you just like insanely stacking Golem damage itself, but since this build has lots of damage sources, including Thorns, including Shadow Blight, and also Golem, going for damage to cursed enemies I think is just better, especially considering the number is not that far off from Golem damage. So damage to curse is the optimal offensive affix here, again, where the weapons affix would be minion attack speed. And for the aspect here, I have Needle Flare, which is sort of a Thorn staple, and one of the 2 pieces, including my Razor Plate, that I'm sort of differing from a traditional Shadow Blight or Shadow Minions build, right? Moving on to my amulet, again, very much not optimized. I have movement speed and max life. You can also have stuff like crit chance if you want to boost your golem damage. That's probably my preference. And also cooldown reduction is extremely helpful too. For the resource tempering here, a great option is ultimate cooldown reduction. You can also go for golem active cooldown reduction, but I think it's a bit overkill in my opinion. I'd rather have better uptime on my Bone Storm. But again, if you have enough cooldown reduction in general and lucky hit chance with your Decrepify to lower cooldowns and your Skeletal Reapers, you find that your uptime on Bone Storm is really high, then you can consider going for Golem active cooldown as well. And for some of the other general affixes on the amulet, the passive that you'll want on it is probably going to be Hellbent Commander, because that'll greatly boost your minions damage. But you can also go for something like amplified damage for some all-rounded good damage. What I have right now is Fueled by Death, which increases my damage whenever I consume a corpse, which is actually not bad as well. Moving on to my rings, you want crit chance. Attack speed is really strong, and then lucky hit chance could be good, especially if you're running Infinimist or want more uptime on your ultimate. You can also save one slot out of your gloves and rings for a chance to make enemies vulnerable, especially if you're not running corpse tendrils like I am. For the affix here, I'm running Blighted, because this again is a Shadow Blight build. And of course, I forgot to mention for my amulet, I'm running Hardened Bones, so this is pretty standard though. For my other ring, I'm running Reanimation to increase minion damage. For the affixes, it's much the same: attack speed, crit, lucky hit, or maybe you don't need the lucky hit as much if you have enough cooldowns, and just go for intelligence or max life is also a good option too. For tempering, of course, is ultimate cooldown reduction for the resource aspect, damage to cursed enemies as the offensive aspect. And again, if I go back to this ring, this is messed up because I actually bricked the tempering on this one, so please disregard the corpse tendrils damage here. And last but not least, for my offhand, the best affixes to have here I would say are crit, cooldown reduction, and either lucky hit, max life, or intelligence depending on sort of what you need. For the aspect, I have Ultimate Shadow because this will turn my Bone Storm into a darkness skill, and since especially Bone Storm actually revolves around both yourself and your golem, this will add a ton of procs to your Shadow Blight and just be a huge damage increase just through that. For the tempering, I went over the weapons tempering, its minion attack speed and damage to cursed. For Paragon, it's actually quite straightforward. Essentially, you want to get 7 glyphs and you just want to go through these respective nodes. So starting with Cult Leader, and then you also want Hulking Monstrosity because your golem is still going to be a huge source of your damage, and especially against bosses is extremely powerful. Next, we also have, let's see, Flesh Eater is a good one, and then Scent of Death is also quite good. So these are the main, say, multiplicative legendary nodes that you want to take no matter what, and then you're just really stretching out your points to go into 7 boards, right? You'll get stretched pretty thin, but you will be able to reach 7 boards like such. There are a couple of other configurations that you can go for, but this is largely based on Maxwell, again, Maxwell Shadow Necromancer minion build, and there are just a couple of tiny tweaks that I made myself. As for the glyphs though, it's Dead Razor, Golem. Again, golems are really strong this patch. Territorial is good. You get damage reduction too for some additional safety, although you could arguably run with another damage multiplier if that might be better, and if you have like an Infinimist sort of setup with your build, which you can go for. Amplify is just good in general for additional damage while cursed or enemies are cursed. Essence, I'm still testing this out. This doesn't affect Thorns because Thorns doesn't crit, but again, with golems contributing such a large amount of your damage, I think Essence might still be worth it, especially considering how big of a multiplier it gives. Scourge is just really good as well because you're running shadow damage, and with using Blight on enemies and your Bone Storm as well, you'll be able to benefit from this. And just the effect where you get increased shadow damage over time from putting intelligence around this glyph, it'll also allow you to scale up your Shadow Bite passive as well, right? Which has its damage multiplied by the amount of shadow damage over time bonus that you have. So that's just another sort of bonus there. And last but not least, I have Exploit here. This allows you to do additional damage whenever you hit an enemy that is vulnerable as well. And in which case, we do have sources of vulnerable, right? Because it's also important for scaling up Thorns. Some other alternatives to consider though would be Corporeal, which will allow you to increase your movement speed. This would be better for speed farming, so you could actually swap this in whenever you want. And then Revenge might also be a good option because this is a Thorns oriented build, and this will just give you another multiplier if, say, you don't want to run something like Essence, right? You want to go like pure Thorns and not care so much about the crit damage from your golem, let's say. Now, in terms of how to pilot and the general playstyle of this build, at least how I like to play it, with Bone Storm up, I'm pretty fearless. I just go up, curse enemies, and then use Blight on elite enemies and of course bosses, and use my Golem cooldown mostly on elites and aura packs. And then after those cooldowns are over, I will use Blight where appropriate on elite enemies especially, and then sort of spam Raise Skeleton during my downtime because it actually helps me generate essence with the Grim Harvest passive that I've spec'd into, allowing me to spam more Blights. And with Decrepify, of course, lowering cooldowns on stuff and allowing my Bone Storm to come up kind of soon. But assuming my Bone Storm is not up and I don't have the barrier up, I'll try to sort of hang back a little bit and sort of allow my minions and give my minions time to go forward and tank damage, and of course use my Golem to taunt enemies. And sort of the benefit of this Thorns build is that you're not really wasting time hanging back as much because you're still dealing damage as your minions are taking damage, right? Normally with some other minions builds, you kind of have to wait for your minions to actually catch up and start dealing damage and whatnot, but with the Thorns build, it's a bit less of that because as they sort of run up and even before they kind of start hitting enemies, they might even start taking damage and allow you to thus deal damage through Thorns. And then Blood Mist is obviously there as a panic button, especially if you get crowd controlled, like you don't have the Golem active to break you out of crowd control, or just if you need to stay alive for whatever reason. And that is pretty much all of my coverage so far, at least, of the Thorns Shadow Minions Necromancer. I'll be sure to provide a detailed update once I optimize and min-max this build further and test things out by pushing deeper into the pit and so forth. But with that, let me know what you think in the comment section below. I'll be sure to reply to your comments as well. Thank you so much for watching and sticking with me. You can also check out some of my other videos that I'll link in the description box below. And with that, I will catch you in the next one. Happy hunting. Peace.